Lucía walked through the office hallways with the demeanor of someone who had everything under control. Her impeccable attire, upright posture, and the way she greeted each person with a calculated smile made her the perfect image of success. At 35 years old, he had climbed positions within one of the most important companies in the financial sector, consolidating a career that many envied. From the outside, his life seemed a model of stability. I had an apartment in one of the best areas of the city, a group of friends with whom I went out to trendy restaurants, and an agenda full of important meetings. His professional achievements were unquestionable. He led high-impact projects, received constant praise from his superiors, and his name became increasingly louder in the corporate world. But when he got home and closed the door behind him, the feeling of emptiness became unbearable. Lucía would fall on the sofa, let out a long sigh, and look at the city through the large window in her living room. His reflection in the glass gave him an image that did not match what he felt inside. There were times when he wondered if everything he had built really made sense. And on sleepless nights, when the noise of the world faded away, the thoughts I avoided so much appeared. Why do I feel like I don't deserve what I have? When are they going to find out that I'm actually not that good? Why, when I'm about to achieve something great, do I ruin it for no reason? Lucía had been sabotaging herself for years without understanding why. The pattern repeated itself over and over. When he was about to close an important deal, he would inexplicably forget to send a key document. When she had to give a presentation, she would stay up the night before reviewing irrelevant details and arrive exhausted the next day. When he was offered a new opportunity, he found excuses to reject it or postpone the decision until it was too late. Each self-inflicted failure was accompanied by a rational justification. I wasn't ready. It was better to wait. It wasn't the right time. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Self-sabotage was no coincidence. It was as if there was a part inside her that made sure she never advanced too far, never fully shined. An invisible but powerful mechanism that activated fear at the exact moment it was about to take off. The most frustrating thing was that I couldn't talk to anyone about this. How could he explain to his friends or colleagues that, despite his achievements, he felt like a fraud? If he confessed his doubts, would they think that he was actually not as competent as he appeared? So I would smile, make jokes about how busy I was, and move on as if nothing was happening. But inside, something was beginning to break. Confirmation of her self-sabotage came forcefully when her boss, after weeks of deliberation, called her into his office. He looked at her seriously and told her that she was on the list of candidates for a promotion to a management position. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for years. Instead of joy, he felt a knot in his stomach. He thanked his boss, feigned excitement, and left the office with a forced smile. But as soon as she was alone, anxiety took over. That night he couldn't sleep. Obsessive thoughts filled his mind. I'm not ready. I don't know if I want so much responsibility. I'm going to fail. The next few days turned into a disaster. He started arriving late to the office, forgot to respond to important emails, and in a key meeting, he made a mistake that he would never have made under normal conditions. Something inside her was sabotaging the opportunity. When he finally received the news that someone else had been chosen for the promotion, he felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. He convinced himself that it was not the right time, that it had been for the best. But that night, in front of the mirror, he couldn't help but ask himself, why do I keep doing this to myself? I didn't have answers. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he could no longer ignore what was happening. Something about her was stopping her from growing, and if she didn't do something about it, she would remain trapped in this cycle forever. It was time to face the truth. Lucía didn't know it yet, but she was about to begin a journey into the depths of her own being, a journey that would force her to confront the shadows she had avoided for so long. Lucía was sitting in her office when she received the email that would change the course of her life. Subject: congratulations. Lucía, new growth opportunity. He opened it with trembling hands. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as one of the leading candidates for the position of Director of Financial Strategy. Your career at the company has demonstrated an exceptional level of leadership and commitment. The final stage of the process will be a presentation to the Executive Committee next Friday. Congratulations again. Lucía read the message 3 times, but instead of feeling euphoria, her stomach contracted. I had dreamed of this promotion for years. He knew he was capable. He had the experience, the knowledge, the respect of his colleagues. However, the only thing he felt at that moment was fear, a paralyzing fear. He leaned back in the chair, trying to breathe deeply, but his mind had already begun its attack. I'm not good enough. They probably nominated me because there were no other options. When I face the committee, they're going to realize that I don't really know anything. I'm going to disappoint them. They're going to humiliate me. The sensation was almost physical, as if his body was preparing for an imminent threat. His hands were cold, his chest tight. It was irrational. He had been with the company for years. He had managed complex projects. His work spoke for itself. But there was something inside her that refused to accept its own merit. The imposter syndrome. It had settled in his mind like a parasite. Throughout the week, instead of preparing for the presentation, Lucía sank into procrastination. He found excuses to avoid work. He cleaned his house obsessively. He distracted himself with social networks. He even started watching online courses that had nothing to do with his project. The presentation date was approaching, and his anxiety was growing. The night before, she sat in front of the computer without having prepared anything. I'm going to fail. That thought hit her hard. The thought of standing in front of the committee terrified her. He slammed his laptop shut and plopped down on the couch. Why was he reacting like that? She closed her eyes and, without expecting it, her mind took her to a childhood memory. I was 8 years old. He was in the school auditorium, standing on the stage, holding a diploma. He had won first place in a mathematics contest. He looked into the crowd for his mother, hoping to find pride in her gaze, but his mother did not smile. On the contrary, he had his arms crossed and a gesture of disdain. That night, when they got home, his mother said coldly, "Don't think you're so special, Lucía. Being good at school doesn't mean you're better than everyone else." That comment was recorded in his subconscious. Since then, every time Lucía stood out, she felt inexplicable guilt. He learned to minimize his achievements, not to talk too much about his successes, to fear envy and rejection. His fear of success was not irrational. It was a defense mechanism that she had built since she was a child to avoid losing the love of others. But now, that fear was destroying her. On the day of the presentation, he woke up with a bad migraine. His stomach was churning, his body heavy. He looked in the mirror and saw in his eyes the image of someone who was about to give up. When he arrived at the office, the committee was already meeting. The secretary greeted her with a smile. "Ready when you are, Lucía." He stood at the entrance to the room, his hand on the doorknob. He just had to turn it, go in and do what he had done all his life, prove his ability, but he couldn't. The fear was stronger. At the last second, she mumbled that she felt sick and hurried out. As he walked through the halls with his heartbeat pounding in his chest, he felt a mixture of shame and relief. He had escaped, but deep down, he knew he had just passed up the most important opportunity of his career. That night, lying in her bed, she felt deep sadness. For the first time, she realized that something inside her was actively fighting against never becoming the woman she was destined to be, and that terrified her. The first time she had the nightmare, Lucía woke up with her heart beating so fast that for a moment she thought she was going to faint. The dream was always the same. She was on a dark stage, with a single spotlight pointed directly at her. In front of her, an immense crowd, blurry faces that watched her in silence. She knew she had to speak, that they were waiting for her. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried to scream, but his voice faded before escaping his throat. Desperation grew as the audience stared at her, in dead silence, as if they were judging her. The anguish woke her up just as the light became more intense, blinding her completely. That nightmare haunted her night after night. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself in the same scenario again, trapped in the same panic, unable to speak, unable to flee. It was as if his own subconscious was trying to tell him something. "Maybe you should talk to someone about this," suggested Marcos, his college friend, one afternoon when they met for coffee. Lucía rolled her eyes. "I don't need therapy," he responded, with a defensive tone. "Are you sure? You haven't slept well for weeks, you look exhausted, and you've told me more than once that you sabotage yourself. Maybe there is something deeper behind all this." Lucía looked away. The thought of going to therapy made him uncomfortable. Not because he thought it was unnecessary, but because deep down he knew it meant facing things he had buried for too long. "I don't know," he murmured. Marcos smiled kindly. "Sometimes, the answers we avoid the most are the ones we need the most." That phrase remained echoing in his mind. That night, after another nightmare, he got out of bed with his heart pounding and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His own face returned a look he didn't recognize. For the first time, she felt that there was something inside her that was watching her from the shadows, something that had always been there, but that she had learned to ignore. The shadow. I had read about the concept in some psychology books, but had never paid much attention to it. According to Carl Jung, the shadow is the hidden part of our personality, the one that we repress because it is uncomfortable or unacceptable to us. It doesn't go away, it just hides, and when we don't confront it, it takes control of our lives in unexpected ways. Is that what's happening to me? The next day, without thinking too much, he dialed the number of a therapist who had been recommended to him a long time ago and made an appointment. I had no idea what I was about to discover, but something inside whispered to him that this would be the beginning of a journey with no return. The waiting room smelled of lavender incense. The walls were covered in abstract paintings with soft, relaxing tones. Lucía drummed her fingers on her leg as she looked at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes until your first therapy session. For a moment, he thought about running away. A part of her kept telling her that she didn't need him, that she could figure it out on her own. But the truth was that she had been repeating the same patterns for too long, crashing into the same invisible walls that she herself built. If I don't do something different, nothing will change. When the office door opened, Lucía found a woman with warm eyes and a serene expression. "Lucía, welcome. I'm Sofia. Come in, please." The consultation was a welcoming space. There was a bookshelf full of psychology and philosophy books, a dimly lit lamp, and a soft armchair that invited you to relax. Lucía sat up straight, not knowing exactly how to start. Sofia gave him time. He watched her patiently, as if waiting for the words to emerge on their own. "Why did you decide to come to therapy?" he finally asked. Lucía sighed. "I self-sabotage," he confessed, feeling a pang of shame as he said it out loud. "Just last week I lost a great promotion opportunity because I became paralyzed. It's like there's a part of me that doesn't let me move forward." Sofia nodded. Without interrupting her, "What do you feel when you think about being successful?" Lucía remained silent. It was not a question that had been asked before. "Don't know. I'm supposed to want success. That's supposed to be the right thing to do, right? But when I'm close to achieving it, something in me resists." Sofia smiled slightly. "Let me rephrase that. When you think about shining, about standing out, what emotions appear?" Lucía swallowed. The images came to his mind like a storm. His mother's stern gaze, his father's cold words. Fear, he whispered. Sophia leaned forward a little. Who taught you to doubt yourself? The question hit her like a punch to the chest. Lucía felt her throat close. His breathing became shorter, as if he had just opened a door he had kept sealed for decades. He closed his eyes. And then, he remembered it all. The girl who was never enough. He was 10 years old when he won his first medal in a literature competition. She was excited. She ran home with the diploma in her hands, waiting to hear words of pride. But her mother barely looked at her. Don't think you're better than everyone else because of this, he said in a sharp voice. People who think they are special end up alone. Lucía looked down, feeling ashamed that she did not understand. Years later, when he entered college on a full scholarship, his father simply nodded nonchalantly and continued reading the newspaper. Never. I'm proud of you. Never a hug of recognition. Every time it shined, I felt like disappointed to someone, as if his success was a betrayal of his family. My mother, he finally said, his voice trembling. She taught me not to stand out, not to make noise, not to be too much. And your father? Sophia asked softly. Lucía swallowed. He was never really present. He was a cold man. He didn't care what he did, as long as it didn't bother him. Sophia nodded understandingly. Do you know what happens when we grow up without emotional validation? Lucía shook her head, although deep down she already knew the answer. We learn to doubt ourselves, Sophia continued. We look for approval everywhere, because we never received it from where it mattered most. And when we don't find it, we convince ourselves that we don't deserve it. Lucía felt a knot in her stomach. All his life he had sought external approval, from his bosses, from his friends, from his relationships. And every time she got it, she felt empty, like it wasn't enough. Your self-sabotage is not accidental, Lucía, said Sophia. It's a learned pattern. A survival strategy you develop to protect yourself from rejection. Lucía remained silent, letting those words sink in, a centering in your mind. For the first time in his life, he began to understand that his fear was not irrational. It was an open wound that he had learned to ignore. And now, there was no going back. The sessions with Sophia had opened a door in Lucía's mind. And now that door refused to close. Over the next few days, his world was filled with signs he hadn't seen before. Every time she tried to focus on work, her mind pushed her to check social media, to postpone important tasks, to find excuses to avoid decisions that would move her forward. It was as if something inside her was fiercely resisting change. And then there were the dreams. The nightmare scenario had changed. It was no longer the spotlight that blinded her. Now he was in an endless maze, with dark hallways and closed doors. He ran through the hallways, trying to find a way out. But every time she reached a door and turned the handle, something stopped her. Sometimes the lock would get stuck. Other times, the door would vanish before I could open it. And on some occasions, he felt an invisible presence on the other side, as if something or someone was preventing him from moving forward. He would wake up feeling like he had walked miles without getting anywhere. Sophia didn't seem surprised when she told him this in their next session. The unconscious protects us from what it perceives as a threat, he explained, even when that threat is change. Lucía frowned. But change is good, right? It depends, Sophia answered calmly. Your mind has learned that staying in the same place is safe. Every time you try to leave that area, barriers appear. Those closed doors in your dreams represent your own defense mechanisms. Lucía remained silent. Defense mechanisms. He had read about them in an article, but had never associated them with his own life. Self-sabotage is a defense mechanism, Sophia continued. And he is not the only one. Procrastination, rationalization, emotional avoidance. All are strategies of the unconscious to keep you within the known. Lucía felt a chill run down her spine. So, my own mind is preventing me from changing? Sophia nodded, because change implies risk. And risk implies the possibility of failure, rejection, pain. Your unconscious believes it is protecting you, Lucía sighed. Feeling trapped in a paradox, she wanted to move forward, but every time she tried to do so, something inside her pulled her back. How do I get out of this maze? He finally asked. Sofia looked at her with a slight smile. First, by stopping fighting him. Lucía looked at her with confusion. Aren't I supposed to overcome my fears? Yeah, but overcoming them does not mean eliminating them. It means understanding them. Lucía pursed her lips, thoughtful. Sofia continued. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you are self-sabotaging, don't try to force yourself to act differently right away. Just watch it. Ask yourself, what is my mind telling me? What fear is behind this resistance? Lucía nodded slowly. For years, she had tried to fight her tendency to procrastinate, to doubt herself, to avoid certain decisions. It had never occurred to him, listen to what your mind was trying to tell you. The labyrinth is not your enemy, Lucía, Sofia said in a low voice. It's just a reflection of your story. That night, when he closed his eyes, he found himself in the same dark hallway again. But this time, instead of running desperately, she stayed still. He looked around. He took a deep breath. He approached one of the doors and placed his hand on the cold wood. He didn't try to open it. He didn't try to force her. He just listened. And in the silence of his own unconscious, for the first time, he thought he heard a whisper. An echo of his own past. A message that, perhaps, had always been there. Psychological. Theme. Defense mechanisms are psychological strategies that we use, unconsciously, to protect ourselves from emotions that we consider dangerous. However, when they become automatic, they can keep us stuck in destructive patterns. The first step to change is not to fight against these mechanisms, but understand why they are there. Lucía was beginning to hear her own shadow, and that would change everything. Lucía entered the office with a strange feeling in her chest. It wasn't anxiety or fear exactly. It was more of a subtle pressure, as if something inside her was about to break. He sat in front of Sofia and crossed his legs nervously. I was thinking a lot about what we talked about last time, she said, fiddling with the ring on her finger. About my fears and those mechanisms that stopped me. Did you discover something new? Sofia asked in her serene tone. Lucía took a breath. Yeah. I realized that there is a specific time when my self-sabotage kicks in the strongest. Sofia looked at her with interest. When? Lucía licked her lips before answering. When people start seeing me. Sofia nodded slightly, as if she wasn't surprised. Tell me more. Lucía let out a sigh and rested her elbows on her knees. It's like it's okay to be good at what I do, but only to a certain point. When I start to stand out too much, when I receive praise or someone points to me as an example, that's when something inside me shuts down. Her therapist watched her silently, giving her space to continue. It happens to me at work, Lucía continued. Just when I was about to receive that promotion, instead of feeling happy, I panicked. Other times, when I have been recognized for an achievement, I feel guilt instead of pride. As if it's not okay to stand out. Sofia tilted her head. Why do you think you feel guilty? Lucía remained silent. I didn't know. Or maybe she did, but she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Don't know. Let me ask you another question, Sofia said, in her calm but deep tone. When you were a girl and you shined at something, how did others react? The question hit her like a blow. Suddenly, her mind took her to a scene buried in memory, a memory. Lucía was 8 years old. She had just received an award at school for being the best in her class. She was excited with the diploma in her hands, running to her mother to tell her the news, but his mother did not smile. Don't brag, Lucía, he said in a stern voice. It's not nice to make others feel bad. Lucía felt the emotion in her chest fade. But Mom, the teacher said that. I don't want to hear it, her mother interrupted. Come help me with dinner. The recognition was forgotten on the table. That night, Lucía learned a silent lesson. Being brilliant meant being punished. End of memory. Lucía blinked, returning to the present. He felt a lump in his throat. My mother. He whispered. Every time I excelled at something, he made me feel guilty. As if doing things right was a bad thing. Sophia nodded understandingly. Many children grow up with the message that shining is dangerous, that if they stand out, they will be rejected. And when that happens, they learn to hide. Lucía felt a chill. All his life he had done exactly that. He made sure not to attract too much attention, not to make others uncomfortable with your achievements. And when someone saw her too much, when her talent became evident, she shut down, because deep down, she was still that girl who was afraid of losing her mother's love. It's incredible how something so small can mark your entire life, he whispered. It wasn't something small, Lucía, Sophia responded. It was a repeated message. It was a pattern. And now it's part of you. Lucía felt her chest tighten. How do I change it? Sophia looked at her sweetly, first recognizing it. Realizing that every time you feel guilt about your success, it is not because you have done something wrong. It is the voice of your past speaking to you. Lucía remained silent, letting those words settle inside her. And second, Sophia continued, asking you, whose approval are you still seeking? The question made his heart stop for a second. She already knew the answer. All his life, he had sought validation from his mother. He had tried not to make her feel uncomfortable, not to disappoint her. But at what cost? He had spent years minimizing himself, hiding, self-sabotaging. Lucía, Sophia said softly. Are you ready to stop hiding? Lucía swallowed. I wasn't sure, but I did know one thing. I no longer wanted to continue living in fear of being seen. The air in the office was thick, heavy with invisible expectations. Lucía had the contract for her promotion in front of her, the piece of paper that represented everything she had worked on for years, but I couldn't sign it. His hands were sweating. His breathing was short. His mind issued silent warnings. You can't. You're not ready. What if everything goes wrong? She had worked so hard to get here, but now at the key moment, a voice inside her resisted with all her might. Sophia's words came back to her mind. Your unconscious believes it is protecting you. But protecting her from what? Lucía abruptly got up from her desk and went to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror, and that was where it happened. A moment of brutal clarity. There was no boss blocking her. There was no couple stopping her. There was no society that told him he couldn't. It was her. It had always been her. For the first time, he saw the truth with painful clarity. She herself had been her worst enemy. A lump formed in his throat. He leaned against the sink and closed his eyes, trying to calm himself, but his chest felt like a cage. He took a deep breath. If her mind was protecting her, then she had to understand about what. He forced himself to hold his own gaze in the reflection and asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. If I take this chance and fail, what does that mean to me? A chill ran down his spine. His fear was not of success. He was exposed to failure. If he failed in small ways, no one would notice. But if I failed when I was at the top, everyone would see her fall. Her mind did not protect her from success. It protected her from shame. But that protection was a prison, because the price of avoiding failure was never allowing yourself to shine. Lucía felt a tightness in her chest. He wanted to take a deep breath, but he couldn't. The fear was too real. He took his phone and dialed Sophia's number. I can't breathe, he whispered as soon as the therapist answered. Lucía, tell me what you're feeling right now, Sophia responded calmly. Panic, he said with a broken voice. I realize that I am holding myself back. But I can't help it. My mind resists. That's normal, Sophia said. Is called cognitive dissonance. Lucía leaned against the bathroom wall. Dissonance what? Your brain is fighting between two versions of you. Sophia explained. The version that has lived in fear, that has learned to hide. And the version that wants to break that pattern. Lucía felt her stomach turn. Why do you feel so horrible? Because you are challenging an identity that has kept you safe. Lucía closed her eyes. That made sense. He had built his life around certain beliefs. I'm not good enough. I don't deserve that much. If I expose myself too much, they will hurt me. Those beliefs had been his refuge. But now he wanted to tear them down, and his mind was fighting back with everything it had. Lucía, listen to me, Sophia said firmly. The anxiety you feel now is the sign that you are on the threshold of change. But the only way to get through it is to get through the fear. Lucía swallowed. Sophia continued. Look in the mirror again. Lucía looked up. With the phone still pressed to her ear, his reflection was there. But something in his face had changed. Tell me what you see, Sophia whispered. Lucía swallowed. I see someone who has spent years running from herself. Sophia smiled on the other end of the line. Exact. Now, ask that version of you in the mirror a question. Ask him, why are you so afraid? Lucía felt a chill, but she did it. His lips trembled as he spoke the words, why are you so afraid? And in his mind, the answer came like a whisper. Because if you make a mistake, no one will love you. The tears fell uncontrollably. It was her inner child who had responded, the girl who had learned to tie her value to the recognition of others. The girl who thought she only deserved love if she was perfect. Lucía dropped to the floor, with her back against the bathroom wall. He cried in silence, not because of weakness, but because for the first time, it was really looking. And that was the first step to freeing himself. Lucía sat on the couch in the office with her hands clasped. She had spent days in a state of constant restlessness, as if something inside her was falling apart. Sophia observed her with her usual calm. You seem different today, he said. Lucía breathed out a shaky breath. I feel empty. Empty? Sophia tilted her head. What is that feeling like? Lucía bit her lip. As if there is something inside me that is disappearing. Something that was always there, but now it doesn't. Makes sense. Sophia smiled softly. That's because you're going through a duel, Lucía. Lucía frowned. Duel? Because? Sophia rested her elbows on the armrest and intertwined her fingers. When someone dies, we feel pain because we say goodbye to their presence. But what we don't always understand is that we also experience internal grief. When we change deeply, when we leave a part of our identity behind, we feel like we are losing something. Lucía felt a chill. And what am I losing? Sophia looked at her tenderly. The version of yourself that learned to survive with self-sabotage. The words fell on Lucía like a weight on her chest. Sophia continued. Your fear, your insecurity, your need to hide, have been part of your identity for years. Not because they are what you are, but because they helped you cope with a world that made you feel insecure. Lucía felt tears burning in her eyes. But if I leave all that behind, what is left of me? Sophia watched her in silence. Lucía swallowed. Her deepest fear was there, naked in front of her. Who was she without her fears? Without the guilt, without the constant doubt, without the little inner voice that convinced her that she wasn't enough. His chest tightened. It's terrifying, he whispered. Because at least when I was afraid, I knew what to expect. Sophia nodded. That's why most people cling to their destructive patterns. Because even though they hurt, they are family. Lucía looked down. It was true. She had lived for so many years believing that she didn't deserve to shine. But the simple fact of imagining herself free of that thought made her feel like she was floating in a void. What happened when there were no excuses left? What happened when fear dissolved? Sophia interrupted her with an unexpected question. Have you had strange dreams lately? Lucía remained motionless. Yes, I had them. and one in particular had left her shaking that very night. "I dreamed I was in a dark room," he whispered. "In front of me, there was a huge mirror. And in the reflection, I saw myself." Sophia encouraged her to continue with a look. Lucía swallowed. "But it wasn't exactly me. It was a scary version of me. With his face covered in shadows." The memory made her shudder. "And then, that version of me started laughing. Not a kind laugh, but a cruel one. As if he was making fun of me." Sophia leaned forward. "What did you do?" Lucía closed her eyes. "I took something. A heavy object. And I broke the mirror." The image of the glass exploding was still etched in his mind. "And when the mirror broke, the dark version of me disappeared." Sophia smiled approvingly. "That dream is very powerful, Lucía, because the mirror represents your old identity, the one that has been governed by fear. In the dream, you destroy it." Lucía felt chills on her skin. "And what does it mean that the shadow has disappeared?" Sophia looked at her intensely. "That you are ready to emerge." Lucía's chest expanded with an air of possibility. "But emerging towards what?" Sophia leaned back with a smile. "Towards the version of yourself that does not need fear to exist." Lucía felt hot tears slide down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, the idea of being herself, without ties to the past, without the identity of self-sabotage. It didn't scare him. It gave him hope. Lucía was sitting at her desk, with the promotion letter open in front of her. His hands rested on the table, but his heart was pounding. It was official. The company offered her a promotion to regional director, a position that she had always dreamed of, but that, until now, she had never believed was for her. "In the past, I would have found some excuse. There will be better candidates. I'm not ready. It's too much responsibility." But this time, something inside him felt different. He took a deep breath and let the fear settle in his chest. He didn't try to ignore it or reject it. Simply he observed it. "Because now I knew something I didn't understand before. Fear was not his enemy. It was a sign that he was stepping out of his comfort zone. And growing up is always scary." The next day, Lucía met with Sophia, her therapist. "I'm afraid," he said, with a half smile, "but this time I don't want to run away." Sophia nodded with satisfaction. "That's the real change, Lucía. Many people think that transformation means stopping feeling afraid, but the truth is that fear never completely goes away. What changes is how we react to it." Lucía rested her elbows on her knees. "Before, every time fear appeared, I convinced myself that I was not capable, that I did not deserve the opportunities. Now, I feel like I can see it with different eyes." Sophia watched her carefully. "How would you describe it now?" Lucía thought about it for a moment. "Before, fear made me feel small, like a girl who didn't know what to do. Now, it's more like a traveling companion. He's there, but he's not behind the wheel." Sophia smiled. "That's the difference between being governed by fear and learning to walk with it." Lucía felt a lump in her throat. "All my life I thought bravery meant not feeling afraid. But now I understand that being brave is acting despite him." The words resonated in his own heart. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel proud of herself. The day of the meeting with the board of directors arrived. Lucía entered the room with her head held high. "Not because I wasn't nervous. I was." His heart was pounding and his palms were slightly sweaty. But this time he didn't try to force himself to calm down. He didn't berate himself for feeling that way. He just accepted that it was normal. The general director spoke. "Lucía, we have reviewed your history in the company, and we believe that you are the right person to lead regional expansion. What do you think?" A silence took over the room. Lucía took a deep breath. "I would love to take on this challenge," he said firmly. "I know it will be a challenge, but I am ready." The words came out of his mouth with a confidence he had never felt before. The managers nodded, satisfied with his answer. "We're glad to hear it," the director replied. We are sure you will do a great job." When the meeting ended, Lucía left the building feeling her chest expand with something new. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a false sense of confidence. Era peace. Because for the first time, she hadn't let fear decide for her. That night, Lucía had another dream. She was standing on the top of a hill with a huge sky above her. A warm breeze caressed his face. In front of her was a precipice, but this time I didn't feel terror. There were no shadows. There were no voices whispering that he couldn't. Just an open, infinite horizon. He took a step forward and dropped down, but instead of falling into the void, it started to fly. Lucía entered Sofia's office with a strange feeling in her chest. It wasn't fear, nor anxiety. It was something deeper. For months, she had been on a path of self-discovery, facing her shadow, her fears, and her tendency to self-sabotage. Now, after all that travel, I felt like I was at a turning point. He sat down on the couch and let out a sigh. "I think I have changed more than I imagined." Sofia smiled softly. "Tell me more." Lucía was silent for a moment, searching for the right words. "Before, when I felt fear or doubt, I saw it as a sign that something was wrong with me. As if just feeling insecure meant I wasn't capable." He looked at his therapist with a new gleam in his eyes. "But now I see it differently. I realize those emotions were not the problem. The problem was how he interpreted them." Sofia nodded approvingly. "And how do you interpret them now?" Lucía exhaled slowly, like parts of me that just wanted to protect me. There was a brief silence. Sofia tilted her head. "What you just said, Lucía, is a great step in your process." Lucía narrowed her eyes. "Because?" Sofia held his gaze. "Because it means that you are ready to integrate your shadow." Lucía felt a chill run down her spine. They had talked about the shadow before, but until now he had not fully understood its meaning. Sofia continued, "Your shadow was not your enemy. She was the guardian of your unresolved pain." The words hit her with devastating clarity. "Guardian?" Sofia nodded. "Self-sabotage, fear, guilt. Everything that you thought limited you was not there to destroy you. I was there to protect you." Lucía felt her chest shrink. "But protect me from what?" Sofia looked at her tenderly. "Of the pain you weren't ready to face." Lucía lowered her head. All her life she had avoided looking inside herself because she feared what she would find. But now, after everything he had been through, he understood. Self-sabotage was not an enemy I had to eliminate. It was a learned response. A shield I had built to cope with the fear of rejection, of failure, of not being enough. And for the first time, I didn't need it anymore. That night, Lucía had another dream. I was in a dark forest, walking along a wet dirt path. Around them, the trees rustled in the wind. Suddenly, he saw a figure in the distance. It was herself, but not the strong, confident version he had begun to build. It was as me from the past, the scared girl who was afraid to shine, the young woman who self-sabotaged so as not to be seen, the woman who convinced herself that she was not enough. Lucía felt a lump in her throat. For a moment, he thought about walking away. But this time, he did something different. He took a step towards her. The older version of herself looked at her with eyes filled with fear. "I don't want to disappear," he whispered. Lucía felt tears burning in her eyes. "You don't have to do." He took his past self's hand and held it firmly. "You are not my enemy. You were just trying to protect me." A tremor ran through the forest. The shadows around them began to dissipate. The old Lucía looked at her one last time, and then melted inside her. Lucía woke up with a gasp. His heart was pounding, but not out of fear. By understanding, he had integrated his shadow. In her next session, Sofia received her with a knowing look. "It seems like something changed in you." Lucía nodded slowly. "I had a dream." He told him everything. When he finished, Sofia smiled. "That is the true meaning of healing, Lucía. It's not about eliminating the parts of yourself that you fear. but about recognizing, honoring, and integrating them. Lucía let out a sigh. I think that, for the first time, I completely accept myself. Sophia watched her proudly. And when we accept ourselves, we stop fighting against ourselves, and then we become unstoppable. Lucía smiled. He knew that his journey was not over yet, but this time, I wasn't afraid to move forward. The morning sun came through the window of her apartment, illuminating the desk where Lucía worked. His computer was open, full of emails, reports, and scheduled meetings. A normal day in her new position as regional director, but something was different. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of doubt on his shoulders. Several weeks had passed since he accepted the promotion, and although the fear had not completely disappeared, something inside him had transformed. Now, when the voice of insecurity appeared, she recognized it. I knew where it came from. He was no longer running from her. He no longer let her decide for her. That afternoon, while he was reviewing some reports, his assistant knocked on the door. Lucía, they're looking for you at the reception. Lucía frowned, surprised. When she came down, she saw her friend Paula waiting for her with a smile. How does it feel to be a powerful woman? Paula joked, hugging her. Lucía smiled. Strange, different, but fine. They went to a nearby cafeteria. As she stirred her coffee, Paula looked at her curiously. Tell me the truth. Do you still feel afraid? Lucía was silent for a moment. Before, I would have said no, that I was over everything. But now I understood that the truth was more complex. Yes, he admitted. But it doesn't paralyze me anymore. Paula raised an eyebrow. What is the difference? Lucía rested her elbows on the table and smiled softly. Before, when I felt afraid, I thought it meant I wasn't good enough. That if he doubted me, then maybe he didn't deserve what he had. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Now I understand that fear doesn't mean I can't do it. It just means I'm growing. Paula looked at her with admiration. Wow, you've become another person. Lucía shook her head. Not in another. Just the version of me I always wanted to be. Days later, Lucía was in a meeting with her team when a young analyst asked to speak. I have an idea, but I don't know if it's good enough, he said, his tone hesitant. Lucía looked at him carefully. In that moment, she saw herself reflected in him. He thought of all the times he had been in her place, doubting his ability, fearing to be seen. He smiled kindly at her. Share it. All ideas deserve to be heard. The analyst was surprised for a moment, but then he took a breath and spoke with more confidence. As she listened to him, Lucía felt something inside her, a deep certainty that she was in the right place. Success no longer felt like a threat. It was no longer a burden. It was an opportunity. That night, as she looked at the city from her window, Lucía remembered all the opportunities she had missed before. All the time she had made herself small for fear of shining too bright. How many things would she have achieved sooner if she had believed in herself? But instead of regretting it, he smiled. It doesn't matter how long it took to get here. The important thing was that she was now ready to move forward. He looked at his reflection in the glass. Thank you for not giving up, he whispered. For the first time in his life, she felt really proud of being who she was. Lucía remained silent, observing her reflection in the mirror. This time, he wasn't looking for flaws. I wasn't looking for validation. He just looked at himself. Because after all his journey, after facing his fears and passing through his shadow, she finally saw herself for real. Self-sabotage no longer had the same power over her. His fears were still there, but he no longer saw them as enemies. They were just part of her. Parts he now embraced rather than rejected. I had learned that fear doesn't disappear when you grow up, but its meaning does change. Because now I knew that fear is just an indicator that you are about to step into your greatness. Many times, our blocks do not come from us, but from stories we were told. Stories of parents, teachers, society. They told us we weren't good enough. They made us believe that standing out would make us lose love. We were taught to fear our own light, but here you are, and now you have a choice. Continue living under those old stories, or write your own. Lucía closed her eyes and took a deep breath. He felt free, not because the fear had disappeared, but because it no longer prevented him from moving. Success was no longer a threat. Failure was no longer a sentence, and the future was just a blank canvas waiting to be written.